David Packham, thank you so much for joining me. What is the biggest factor in making these particular fires so big?
Well, there is traditionally three factors. They are the weather, the ignitions and the fuel, but I would argue that there are four factors. The most important one in this case is the dryness of the fuel, which comes from the hot, dry weather plus the low humidity. That determines what the fuel moisture content is, and that determines how fierce the fires are. But also another factor that's independently important is the amount of wind. The wind gives the fury to the fire. And then the next important thing, of course, is the ignitions, and there will always be ignitions. The idea that we can stop it means that one's got to have a lot of influence with God to tell him to turn off the lightning for a long time. And the last thing, and the only thing that we people can control is the amount of fuel, and that is what we're not doing.
Now, we've heard locals complain about the amount of fuel that has been left to burn to build up in New South Wales. I've heard also from Queensland. We had information from Victoria that, again, the fuel reduction burns have not been done as we were told by a number of Royal Commissions they should be. What is going on?
Well, I can't quite understand why we are so silly as to allow the amount of fuel to build up that it does, because the Indigenous people, the custodians of our land for 20, 30, 50,000 years, never had fuels like we had now. We now have fuels that are about 10 times greater than what the Aborigines had when we arrived here or when colonisation took place in Australia. And this has been known for, well, the first published Western conclusions about this were in 1962 by a Dr. Alan King, who led the CSIRO bushfire section in the Division of Physical Chemistry. The section had two people in it, Alan, who was the leader, and I was there as a very young and wet behind the ears person.
But how convinced are you that the fuel build-up is behind a lot of the intensity of the fires we're seeing at the moment?
Well, it's not behind a lot of it, it's behind all of it. And the theory says that. The theory is as solid as the universal theory of gravitation. You cannot argue about it if you know anything about physics. And the theory goes very simply like this. The amount of fuel determines the amount of energy that is released. The amount of fuel determines the rate at which the fire moves. A very distinguished American and very clever scientist, George Byram, put all these things together in a simple equation. I, the intensity of the fire, is equal to HWR, where H is the amount of energy given out by every kilogram of fuel, as you'll see on the back of your Weet-Bix packet, and W is the amount of fuel, and R is the rate of spread. But the rate of spread depends upon the amount of fuel. So if you increase the fuel 10 times more than it should be, which is the case now, your fire intensity is 100 times greater and comes up with figures like 70 megawatts per metre. And the maximum that you can extinguish, doesn't matter what you've got, aircraft, bulldozers, anything, the maximum you can extinguish is 3. So it's fantasy land to imagine that we can ever control these fires when we have fuels that are 10 times greater than what the Indigenous people handed over to us. Whether they wanted to or not is a different matter, but that's what happened.
David Packham, I've talked to you, I can't remember for how many years, 10, 20 years, where you have warned this again and again and again. I've mentioned that we've had Royal Commissions giving that warning after every tragedy like Ash Wednesday. You've got to do your fuel reduction burns. Why aren't they being done to the levels that would make us much safer?
Well, I suppose the best clues to this, I thought that there were probably two reasons or two groups. But the best reason for this go to a gentleman called Roger Underwood in Western Australia, who knows an awful lot about this subject. And he said there are 4 groups that profit out of the situation we've got now. One is the Greens, because they can blame it on global warming, which helps their propaganda. The second are the fire agencies, because they can say, oh, look, we didn't put out these fires, in other words, they failed, but give us more money and we will. The third group are the politicians, because they can go out and put their arms around people who've been tragically affected and their popularity goes up. And the fourth group, and I know that you have a very great interest in the media, is the media. They can go out to war stories and have a lovely time and actually not get shot at. So all these people gain from the fires, from this fire situation continuing.
Is there an excuse? I'm hearing some people say, well, look, the fire season was much earlier this year because of the drought, so not all the burns could be done, perhaps. Do you accept that excuse?
No, not at all, for at least 2 reasons. If the fire seasons are coming earlier, and they're not, I have here a book from the Bureau of Meteorology that has got all the fires up to 1947. And what we are experiencing now in October and November, there are huge fires going right back to 1921, 1929. There's pages and pages of it for all over Australia. This is the peak bushfire time in New South Wales. In Queensland, it's a little bit earlier. In Victoria, it is yet to come. And in Tasmania, of course, also in South Australia. So the other thing is that if it is coming earlier, and it's not, that means that prescribed burning conditions are also coming earlier. So you actually have more opportunity. And there's been fabulous opportunities to undertake fuel reduction, which is not an easy and quick thing to do. It takes at least 10 years to get a proper fuel reduction program actually working, which is not bad, because the Indigenous people probably took about 10,000 years to do it as well.
Finally, David Packham, look, we've got a lot more people living in a lot more fire-prone areas. People like living in forests or next to forests, and a lot more people are building out there. Which parts of Australia are you thinking people should be really worried about with the summer coming along?
Well, I think the most dangerous place in the world is probably just north of the Yarra in the sort of Eltham-Warrandyte area, and also the Dandenongs, especially the north-facing slopes of the Dandenongs. They have got to take out normal death tolls, which used to be up to about 70 in disaster fires. Black Saturday reached about 200. Now I think we're looking down the barrel of these areas of about 1,000 deaths or thereabouts, and possibly 5,000 and 10,000 very serious injuries. In terms of the other 2 threats, one is to the total environment, the destruction of the environment, the destruction of our forests as we know them, and also the big threat to Melbourne's water supply and our power supplies. That's 2 factors that economically probably have the biggest threat, but the biggest life threat, the Adelaide Hills is in there, the Hobart area again is in there, and the Grampians. But I'm told that there is work going on in the Grampians that probably would keep the life loss there down a little bit.
David Packham, I don't know what it's going to take for people to focus on the real issues rather than these ideological wars about global warming, but thank you so much indeed for once again giving us a warning, and I just hope that this time more people listen. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Andrew.